Going into their bout at UFC 300, the main questions for me surrounding Alex Pereira and Jamahal Hill are firstly, how will Hill look after his snapped Achilles tendon? Secondly, there is a narrative out there that Alex Pereira struggles with southpaw fighters. Plus, there is the general question of will Pereira's more professional looking striking outclass Jamahal Hill just generally. For those who don't know, the snapped Achilles tendon which Hill suffered is one of the worst injuries that you can have as an athlete, partly because it involves little if any use of the calf muscles in the early stages of recovery.
And that's another thing that from a physio point of view I want to mention is that when you look at your calf after you've been in a boot for 12 weeks, it's shriveled up.
Even once training has resumed, after the tendon has snapped, it can take a long time for it to recover the same spring and elasticity that it had before.
The blood supply to the area is terrible. Hey, that's why you're here, because you've ruptured your tendon, because it doesn't have any propensity to heal itself.
So with Hill snapping his Achilles tendon last July and competing now this coming April, it's still actually a fast turnaround for this type of injury. I have seen some people claim ahead of this matchup that Pereira struggles with southpaws. This narrative mostly seems to come from Bruno Silva being the only man in the UFC that Pereira has not managed to finish. I'm not sure this idea entirely makes sense. If we look at the Adesanya fights, across all 4 fights, there were moments where Adesanya caught Pereira with right hands, which I think is telling because Adesanya prefers to fight southpaw against certain opponents. It's also significant because Jamahal Hill caught Johnny Walker with a right hand counter. Pereira does have slightly unusual tactics against southpaws, but for me he is a significant favourite if this fight stays on the feet. As some of you may know, conventional southpaw versus orthodox tactics involve both fighters trying to control outside foot position whilst being in striking range. Getting the right angle on the opponent makes it a lot easier to land a straight backhand. The issue with Pereira is that he seems so left-hand dominant, the straight right hand is one of his weakest punches. In most of Jamahal Hill's fights, when he's fighting in the southpaw stance, he's using conventional southpaw versus orthodox tactics and circling an angle that will set up a straight left hand. Pereira seems to actually prefer lead foot position, though he occasionally takes outside foot position. I couldn't find many examples of Pereira fighting southpaws in kickboxing, but if you look at Pereira's fights with Macon Silva, he got into a bit of a brawl despite Silva being a physically overmatched opponent. He eventually ended the fight with a devastating knockout, landing a tight hook inside Silva's right hook. Landing a tight hook inside a fighter's guard or inside wider punches is probably Pereira's most common setup for his left hook. Considering that Hill is generally quite a wide puncher, it's not that hard to imagine Pereira catching him with a tight left hook inside the guard or punches of Hill. When you look at the takedown stats for these guys, you will see that Pereira is the only one who has tried takedowns in the UFC. However, if you look at their full MMA careers, you can find examples of Hill going for takedowns early on outside the UFC. Whilst Hill's finishes on takedowns weren't pretty, I think he has enough skill in that department to be able to take Pereira down. If Hill gets on top, then I definitely think he can do damage. For me, Pereira's takedown defense is a weakness that Hill can potentially exploit, even though he's not known for his takedowns. Early on in Pereira's MMA run, I thought he looked like a natural defending takedowns with his low-handed style. It looks to me like since his early fights he's become more of a BJJ style grappler, which I don't think suits him. I should note, Pereira did go for subs on his MMA debut. The issue for me with Pereira's takedown defense is past the initial defense, he often ends up in this front headlock position. There is a sweep from this position which mainly comes from Greco-Roman wrestling, but it's hard to do unless the opponent makes a mistake or you're a high-level wrestler. To me, Pereira looks like someone who is maybe thinking about finishing a guillotine, but in the meantime the headlock isn't offering much defensively. If you compare that to Jamahal Hill, when Teixeira shot to the head outside position, the crossface, or you could call it a face bar, made it much harder for Pereira to hold the position and think about finishing a takedown. Another potential defense for Pereira that would be better than this headlock position would be to shift to the side and push the head down. So overall in this fight, I am picking Pereira to win by knockout. A left hook KO seems the most likely, but it could come from anywhere. I wouldn't completely count Hill out to land a counter strike the way Adesanya did, but under the circumstances, I'd say there is a 10% chance at best of that happening. If Hill does game plan to grapple, then I'll give him a better chance of winning, but I do think either way he'd get caught eventually. Let me know in the comments who you think is going to win this one.